How do you kill a ghost? Not the spectral kind that rattles chains in the attic, but the kind made of light and silver nitrate. A phantom projected 20 feet high in darkened theaters across the globe. How do you assassinate a living myth, especially one who generates more money for your empire than any other living soul? The year is 1962, and the executives at 20th Century-Fox have a problem. Her name is Marilyn Monroe, and they believe they've found an answer. But this story, the one whispered in shadowy backlots and documented in confidential memos, isn't about an unreliable actress spiraling out of control. Forget what you've been told. This was a demolition, a meticulously planned, ruthlessly executed corporate strategy to not just fire the biggest star in the world, but to utterly and publicly destroy her reputation in the process. It was a character assassination designed to cash in on an insurance policy, a cold-blooded plot to erase their most valuable asset and blame the rubble on her. They needed a villain for their financial collapse, and she was the perfect, glittering target. The stage for this corporate drama was set not in Hollywood, but in Rome. Thousands of miles away, another Fox production, a behemoth named Cleopatra, was dying a slow, spectacular death. It was a cinematic black hole, sucking tens of millions of dollars into a vortex of production delays, directorial chaos, and the very public affair of its stars, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. The studio was bleeding out, its lifeblood staining the Italian marble. By the spring of 1962, Fox was staring into the abyss of bankruptcy. Every dollar counted. Every department was ordered to slash its budgets. And back in Los Angeles, a comparatively modest comedy titled Something's Got to Give was about to begin production. It was meant to be the studio's cash cow, a guaranteed hit anchored by the one star who had never, ever lost them money. Marilyn Monroe. She was their financial savior, the golden goddess who had propped up the studio for a decade. And now, she was about to be positioned as its destroyer. The first move in a chess game is often the most telling. For Fox, the opening gambit was the contract itself. On the surface, it was a victory for Marilyn. She was guaranteed $100,000 for the picture, a salary she commanded with ease. But her sharp new lawyer, Milton Rudin, had negotiated something unprecedented for a female star at the time: director approval, a clause that gave her power, control, a say in the creative vision. It seemed like a massive concession from a studio desperate to keep her happy. It was bait. The studio executives, men like production head Peter Levathes, knew exactly who she would choose. George Cukor, a legendary women's director, the man who had guided Katharine Hepburn and Judy Garland to cinematic immortality. He and Marilyn had worked together before, on the musical Let's Make Love. To the public, it was a perfect pairing. In private, it was a lit match dropped into a puddle of gasoline. Cukor resented Monroe. He found her method of acting, her reliance on her coach Paula Strasberg, to be an infuriating affront to his classical style. He complained endlessly about her lateness, her insecurities, her need for dozens of takes to find the emotional truth of a scene. He was a general who demanded soldiers, and Marilyn was a poet. The studio knew this. They counted on it. They handed Marilyn a weapon, knowing full well she would point it directly at a man who would use it to declare war on her. The battle began before a single frame was shot. The script was a mess, a flimsy remake of My Favorite Wife that was being rewritten daily, sometimes hourly, by a desperate Nunnally Johnson. Marilyn, a shrewd judge of material, knew it was weak. She expressed her concerns, offering thoughtful notes, trying to build a character that felt real. Her input was documented, then ignored. The narrative was already being written in the press. Marilyn, the difficult diva, was holding up the production before it even started. Then, she got sick. Not Hollywood sick, a convenient excuse for a long lunch. Genuinely ill, a severe case of sinusitis, a chronic condition that plagued her for years, flared up with a vengeance. Her temperature spiked to over 100 degrees. A studio-appointed doctor, Lee Siegel, examined her and confirmed the diagnosis: acute sinusitis and bronchitis. He ordered her to bed. He told the studio she was in no condition to work. This was not a problem for the studio. It was an opportunity. While Drive, Siegel's medical reports landed on their desks, a different story was being fed to their mouthpieces in the press. Gossip columnists Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, the twin queens of Hollywood's whisper campaigns, began printing thinly veiled items about the trouble on the Something's Got to Give set. The star was unwell. The delays were costly. The implication was clear: Marilyn was faking it. She was being her usual, unprofessional self. It was a classic gaslighting campaign on a corporate scale. They possessed medical proof of her illness, yet they publicly painted her as a malingerer. Every day she was legitimately sick was another black mark in a secret dossier they were compiling against her. A ledger of her unprofessionalism that grew thicker with each doctor-ordered day of rest. The cost of her absence was meticulously calculated and leaked. $100,000 per day, the papers screamed. The Empress was bankrupting the empire. What no one reported was that on many of those days, the set wasn't even ready for her. The script pages hadn't arrived, or Cukor himself was ill. Those details never made the papers. The truth was an inconvenience to the narrative. And then, from the shadows of the soundstage, a new layer of conspiracy emerges. Decades later, rumors would surface of secret audio recordings, allegedly made by a sound engineer on the film who was loyal to Marilyn. He had supposedly become so disturbed by the open conversations between producers and Cukor about pushing her to the edge and building a case against her that he began running a hidden tape machine during their meetings. The existence of these tapes has never been proven. They remain a tantalizing piece of Hollywood lore, a ghost in the machine. But true or not, they speak to the atmosphere of paranoia and betrayal that had enveloped the production. Marilyn felt it. She knew she was being watched, judged, and undermined. She confided in friends that she felt the studio was setting a trap for her. She was walking onto a soundstage every day that felt less like a creative space and more like a courtroom, where she was already presumed guilty. The pressure mounted. Cukor was cold and dismissive on set. He would shoot endless takes of her co-stars Dean Martin and Sid Charisse, but when Marilyn's coverage came, he would rush, printing takes she knew were not her best. It was a subtle form of psychological warfare. He was trying to break her confidence, to make her feel like the amateur he believed her to be. But Marilyn was a fighter. She had survived a horrific childhood and a studio system designed to chew up young women. She wasn't going to be broken that easily. She focused on the work, turning in a performance that, by all accounts, was luminous. The few scenes she completed show a woman at the peak of her comedic talent and her breathtaking beauty. She looked healthier and happier than she had in years. She was doing her job. And then came the invitation. An invitation from the President of the United States. John F. Kennedy was turning 45, and the Democratic Party was throwing a colossal birthday celebration for him at Madison Square Garden in New York City. Peter Lawford, the president's brother-in-law, had personally asked Marilyn to sing Happy Birthday. It was more than a request. It was a summons from Camelot. For Marilyn, who craved legitimacy and acceptance from the intellectual and political elite, it was an irresistible honor. She informed the studio, well in advance, that she would need a single day off to fly to New York for the event. The studio's response was swift and absolute. No. They claimed her absence would be too costly, too disruptive. They forbade her from going. It was a line in the sand. On one side stood her contractual obligation to the studio that was actively working to undermine her. On the other, a once-in-a-lifetime request from the most powerful man in the world. For the executives at Fox, this was the moment they had been waiting for. They knew her fascination with the Kennedys. They knew her desire to be seen as more than just a movie star. They presented her with an impossible choice, knowing exactly which path she would take. They didn't just deny her permission. They dared her to disobey. She went. Of course she went. On the night of May 19, 1962, Marilyn Monroe stepped onto the stage at Madison Square Garden and into the pages of American history. Her performance was legendary, a sultry, breathless rendition of Happy Birthday that was both intimate and epic. It was a scandal, a sensation, a moment of pure, unadulterated star power that would be talked about for generations. She was no longer just a movie star. She was an American icon, intertwined forever with the Kennedy mystique. Back in Hollywood, the executives at 20th Century-Fox celebrated. She had walked right into their trap. Her defiance was the ammunition they needed. It was a clear, public breach of contract. They now had a legitimate, ironclad reason to enact the final phase of their plan. But when she returned to the set, Marilyn had a final, desperate card to play. She knew she was in trouble. She knew the knives were out. She needed to change the narrative, to wrest back control of her own story. She decided to do something so audacious, so headline-grabbing, that it would force the studio to see her not as a problem to be solved, but as an asset they couldn't afford to lose. The script called for a nighttime scene where her character, Ellen Wagstaff Arden, goes for a skinny dip in a backyard swimming pool to taunt her husband, played by Dean Martin. It was meant to be shot with clever angles and body doubles, a suggestive but ultimately tame scene typical of the era. Marilyn had a different idea. On the evening of May 23rd, she invited a select group of photographers from major publications like Life magazine to the set. When it was time to shoot the scene, she dropped the flesh-colored swimsuit she was supposed to wear and slipped into the pool, completely nude. It was her decision, and hers alone. Cukor was stunned. The crew was silent. For the next several hours, Marilyn Monroe gave the performance of her life, not for the movie camera, but for the still photographers lining the pool. This was not a desperate cry for attention from a fading star. This was a calculated act of war. She knew these photos would be a global sensation. She was generating millions of dollars in free publicity for a film whose producers were trying to fire her. She was reminding them, and the world, of the raw, untamable power of her body and her image. She was proving her commitment, showing up and literally bearing all for their picture. It was a strategic masterstroke, a brilliant piece of public relations jiu-jitsu. The world was enchanted. The studio was enraged. They saw it as the ultimate act of defiance. She had seized control of their set, of their narrative. The positive press she generated only made them more determined to get rid of her. It proved how powerful she was, and therefore how dangerous she was to their authority. Her triumph sealed her fate. A few days later, on June 1st, her 36th birthday, the set was dark. A small, pathetic party was thrown for her, a handful of crew members singing a half-hearted happy birthday around a cheap cake. It was a lonely, sad affair, a stark contrast to the adoration of thousands at Madison Square Garden just 2 weeks earlier. The chill in the air was palpable. That day, she once again fell ill, her chronic sinusitis flaring up under the immense stress. Dr. Siegel again ordered her to rest. This was the final nail. The studio now had her birthday illness, on the heels of her unauthorized trip to New York, as the capstone for their case. On June 7, 1962, Peter Levathes officially fired Marilyn Monroe from Something's Got to Give. He simultaneously filed a $750,000 lawsuit against her for breach of contract. The demolition was complete. The news exploded across the globe. 20th Century-Fox released a torrent of statements, feeding the press a curated narrative of an unprofessional, mentally unstable, and pathologically difficult actress who had single-handedly destroyed a multi-million-dollar production. They leaked their carefully compiled dossier of her absences, her late arrivals, the staggering costs incurred. They made her the most famous, unemployed woman in the world. And then, in a move of breathtaking speed, they announced her replacement, a respectable, professional, and reliably punctual actress named Lee Remick. The speed was telling. The negotiations with Remick had clearly been happening for weeks, while Marilyn was still employed, still showing up to work, still swimming naked in their pool to save their film. It was checkmate. The studio had its scapegoat for the board of directors. It had a lawsuit to recoup its costs, and it had a new, compliant actress, ready to step into the dead star's shoes. They had won, but they had forgotten about one man, Dean Martin. Dean Martin was a man who operated by his own code. He was Marilyn's friend, and more importantly, his contract gave him co-star approval. When the studio informed him he would be finishing the picture with Lee Remick, he gave them a simple, unshakable answer. He had signed on to do a movie with Marilyn Monroe. If there was no Marilyn Monroe, there was no movie. He quit. Suddenly, the studio's perfect plan crumbled into dust. Their insurance policy wouldn't pay out if the film was canceled, because the male lead walked out. Their lawsuit against Marilyn was weakened. They were left with a half-finished film, no stars, and a public relations nightmare that was beginning to turn against them. The public loved Marilyn. They tolerated studios. In a battle between a beloved icon and a faceless corporation, the corporation rarely wins the public's heart. Marilyn, from the seclusion of her new home in Brentwood, saw her opening. She did not retreat. She did not break down. She did what she always did when her back was against the wall. She fought back. She launched a media counteroffensive that was just as brilliant and calculated as her midnight swim. She granted a series of stunningly candid interviews, most notably, a career-defining profile for Life magazine by Richard Merriman. For the first time, her own voice, witty, intelligent, deeply self-aware, was heard, unfiltered by studio press agents. She talked about the soul-crushing nature of fame, the business of being a commodity, and the fight to be respected as a serious artist. She wasn't a victim. She was a warrior. Then came the photo sessions, with photographers like George Barris and Bert Stern. The last sitting. In these images, she wasn't playing a character. She was playing herself, stripped of the artifice of Hollywood glamour. She was vulnerable but strong, beautiful but real. She was reshaping her own myth in real time, moving beyond the dumb blonde caricature the studios had built and sold. She was winning. The public was firmly on her side. Fox was now the villain, the greedy, soulless corporation that had dared to discard a national treasure. The pressure on the studio was immense. They were losing the PR war. They were losing millions on the shutdown. Their stock was plummeting. The men who had orchestrated her demolition were now facing their own. In a stunning reversal, Fox fired Peter Levathis, the very man who had fired Marilyn. The board of directors, led by the formidable Darrell F. Zanuck, who was now back in charge, saw only one way out of the disaster. They had to bring her back. Secret negotiations began. The studio that had publicly crucified her was now privately begging for her return, and Marilyn, holding all the cards, negotiated the deal of a lifetime. Her old contract was torn up. A new two-picture deal was drawn, worth a staggering $1 million. She was given a new director, Jean Negulesco, and a completely rewritten script. She had not only won her job back, she had defeated the entire studio. She had faced down the most powerful men in Hollywood and brought them to their knees. In early August of 1962, Marilyn Monroe was preparing to return to 20th Century-Fox, not as a troubled star, but as a conquering empress, reclaimed and triumphant. She had won, but in the shadowy corridors of power, humiliation is a debt that is always repaid. She had beaten the studio at their own game, but what happens when the game itself is rigged, and the price of winning is everything you have left? The lights of the soundstage were ready to be turned back on, but darker shadows were gathering just beyond their reach, and the final act of this tragedy was about to begin. The lights of the soundstage were ready to be turned back on, but darker shadows were gathering just beyond their reach, and the final act of this tragedy was about to begin. But what if the studio wasn't the real enemy? What if the battle with Fox was just a sideshow? A noisy distraction from a far more dangerous game being played in the highest echelons of American power. Marilyn had just proven she could bring a Hollywood studio to its knees. But what happens when your secrets don't just threaten a movie, but a presidency? By the summer of 1962, Marilyn Monroe was not just an actress. She was a political liability. Her intimate relationships with both President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, had moved from the realm of whispered rumor into a clear and present danger. She was a woman who knew too much, who had been privy to pillow talk that could topple an administration during the iciest days of the Cold War. Marilyn herself was becoming increasingly convinced she was being watched. She complained to friends that her phone lines were tapped, that men in unmarked cars were parked on her street. Her psychiatrist, Ralph Greenson, noted her growing paranoia. But was it paranoia if it was real? FBI files, declassified decades later, would confirm that the Kennedys were deeply concerned. J. Edgar Hoover, no friend to the Kennedys, was meticulously documenting the affair, adding it to his own arsenal of secret leverage. Marilyn was no longer just a star. She was a national security risk. And she held a trump card, or at least, she believed she did. Friends spoke of her Little Red Diary, a journal where she supposedly recorded the intimate and political secrets whispered to her by the most powerful men in the world. Things about Cuba, about the mafia, things that had no business leaving the Oval Office, let alone being written in a diary owned by a movie star the administration was desperately trying to distance itself from. The diary became a symbol of her power, but also of her peril, a lifeline and a ticking bomb, all at once. The primary go-between, and perhaps her handler, was the actor Peter Lawford, the Kennedys' brother-in-law. It was Lawford who arranged the liaisons. It was Lawford who brought her into their inner circle. And now, it was Lawford's job to manage the fallout, to gently but firmly cut her loose. The phone calls from the White House and the Attorney General's office stopped. Marilyn's calls went unreturned. She was being ghosted by the President of the United States. For Marilyn, this was a betrayal far deeper than any studio contract dispute. She had been adored, confided in, and then discarded like a finished prop. The triumph of her comeback with Fox was hollowed out by this sudden, chilling silence from Washington. In her mind, the two worlds were colliding. She began to wonder if the studio's initial aggression against her had been quietly encouraged by forces far beyond Hollywood, a strategic move to discredit her, to paint her as unstable and unreliable before she could ever cause a political scandal. Was her firing a professional dispute, or was it a state-sponsored character assassination? Her brand new home on Helena Drive, which should have been her sanctuary, her monument to survival, was becoming a prison. She had soundproofed her bedroom, not for privacy, but to keep listening ears out. She was visited by a strange assortment of people: private investigators, former FBI agents, and figures with murky connections to organized crime, all drawn to the chaos surrounding her. One such figure was Bernard Spindle, a notorious wiretapping expert with connections to Teamster boss Jimmy Hoffa, a man Robert Kennedy was hell-bent on destroying. Spindle claimed he had been hired by Hoffa to bug Marilyn's home, hoping to catch the Kennedys in a compromising position. Suddenly, Marilyn wasn't just a player in the game. She was the board itself, the very ground on which spies, mobsters, and politicians were waging a secret war. On the surface, the first few days of August 1962 were filled with promise. Her new contract with Fox was finalized. The script for Something's Got to Give was being rewritten. Her public image was restored. She was buying new furniture for her home, making plans for the future, talking about doing Shakespeare. She was in control, but underneath, the pressure was reaching an impossible level. The studio wanted her back on set. The Kennedys wanted her silent. And Marilyn, feeling betrayed and cornered, was planning one last desperate move. She was going to go public. She reportedly told her friend and publicist, Pat Newcomb, that she was going to hold a press conference. She was going to tell the world everything, not just about her firing, but about the Kennedys. It was a threat born of desperation, a final, defiant roar from a woman who refused to be silenced, who refused to be erased. She had beaten a movie studio. She believed she could beat anyone, but the White House is not 20th Century-Fox. The stakes are not box office returns, but global power. And the men she was threatening did not file lawsuits. They solved problems. The countdown to the final act had just been fatally accelerated. The afternoon of August 4th, 1962, the day the problem was scheduled to be solved. According to multiple sources, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, accompanied by Peter Lawford, made an unannounced visit to Marilyn's home on Helena Drive. It was not a social call. It was a final, heated confrontation. The subject, the press conference, the secrets, and the Little Red Diary. What happened in that house remains one of the great, dark mysteries of the American century. By evening, a frantic Marilyn was making a series of slurred, desperate phone calls. The last person she tried to reach was Peter Lawford. His line was busy, or he simply didn't answer. He would later give conflicting, panicked accounts of that night. The story of a man trying to outrun a terrible truth. The silence from the Kennedys was now absolute. The ghosting was complete. In the pre-dawn hours of August 5th, the world would learn that Marilyn Monroe was dead. The official report from the Los Angeles coroner's office would read, acute barbiturate poisoning caused by probable suicide. But the scene itself screamed contradiction. There was no water glass by her bed to have swallowed the dozens of pills required. The room was suspiciously tidy. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, was washing sheets at 4 in the morning, and the call to police was delayed for hours. The Little Red Diary was never found. Neither were her phone records for that final day. They vanished, along with any definitive answers. In the days that followed, the story was set in stone. The tragic tale of a depressed, unstable star who couldn't handle the pressure. It was a simple, clean narrative. The kind of story that solves a very complicated problem. A movie star's suicide is a tragedy. A movie star silenced by the highest office in the land is a conspiracy that could unravel a government. In the end, Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a casualty of Hollywood's dream factory. Nor was she simply a victim of her own demons. She was a woman who flew too close to the sun of American power, and was burned not by its light, but by its shadows. She fought the studio and won. But in her final battle, she wasn't up against executives. She was up against the machine that runs the world, a machine that protects its own secrets at any cost. Her death was not an ending. It was a message. The truth about Marilyn Monroe's final days isn't written in the official reports or the studio biographies. It's pieced together from the whispers, the redacted files, and the haunting silence she left behind. Her story is a testament to the fact that the brightest stars often cast the darkest shadows. To explore the lives and secrets buried along the boulevards of Hollywood, subscribe to Boulevard_of_Monroe.